All right, good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me here today. My name is Ashleigh Brown, and I'm a PhD candidate with the University of New South Wales in Canberra. My talk today is based on my PhD thesis, which is about the formation and development of the Royal Australian Air Force during the interwar period. In it, I'm looking at the influence of the Australian Flying Corps' experience and lessons learned during the First World War, the process of creating the Air Force, early developments and challenges the new service faced during its early years, and how it expanded and prepared for the Second World War. Today, I'll be focusing on a smaller element of that, which is the process of forming the Air Force and some of the immediate challenges it faced, namely efforts to dissolve it as an independent service during the 1920s. As you know, the Air Force is the youngest of the Australian Defence Forces services. It formed in 1921 during a period when the importance of aviation was growing in both the military and civil spheres. The decision for Australia to develop an Air Force at this point was greatly influenced by the experience gained in military aviation during the First World War, so our discussion naturally starts there. Each major combatant nation fielded an air service during the First World War. The Royal Flying Corps had been formed in 1912 and was effectively split in two, which was the military wing and the naval wing, and it developed along these lines through to the outbreak of war. They then acted as two separate services, effectively, the RAAF, which was part of the Army, and the Royal Naval Air Service, part of the Navy. Initially, the principal role of aviation was reconnaissance, with the expectation that pilots would occasionally need to fight enemy aircraft in the air in the process of carrying out their recon tasks and from preventing the enemy from doing the same. As the war progressed and aviation technology and tactics evolved, the role for airmen grew and changed. As well as reconnaissance and aerial photography, they spotted for the artillery, provided a direct support to ground and naval forces, conducted aerial bombing, attacked ground targets, and increasingly engaged in aerial combat. By mid-1915, the RAAF's resources were strained and German aircraft were becoming more dominant. As a result, the British began considering how the Dominions could support their air effort. The preference was for individuals from Dominions to join the RAAF directly, or alternatively for Dominion squadrons to be created within the RAAF. New Zealand, South Africa, and Canada each contributed flying and technical personnel directly to the RAAF. For its part, New Zealand contributed 300 officers, and around 3,000 South Africans were commissioned in the British Air Arms and Number 28 Squadron RAAF, which worked with British forces in East Africa, became designated the South African Squadron. By the end of the war, over 7,200 Canadians had served in the RAAF and Royal Air Force, and a further 725 in the RNAS. The scale of Canada's contribution was significant. In the last month of the war, 24% of the RAF's officers were actually Canadian. In addition to personnel, Canada was also home to various schools and depots for the British Air Arms and contributed significantly to the aviation industry. Australia wanted a more distinct Australian contribution. As such, it was the only Dominion to field an individual flying corps rather than committing personnel to the RAAF directly. Although more apparent as a standalone contribution, in practicality, the AFC was not overly different from the contribution of other Dominions. It remained firmly under British operational and administrative command. Australia fielded 8 squadrons overseas, 4 training and 4 service squadrons. In addition to their AFC numbers 1 through 4 for the service squadrons, each was also assigned an RAAF number, 67, 68, 69, and 71. Today, I will be referring to them by their AFC identifiers. I won't be speaking about the AFC in detail, but I would like to give a brief overview of each of the service squadrons, including their members, who went on to be key figures in Australian aviation, either military or civil, after the war. So Number 1 Squadron arrived in the Middle East in March 1916, forming part of the RAAF's 5th Wing, which was responsible for reconnaissance, aerial photography, artillery cooperation, and aerial bombing. The squadron remained in the Middle East for the duration of the war. It was initially commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Edgar Reynolds and then Major Thomas Rutledge, with Richard Williams, who had been a flight commander with the squadron, taking command in May of 1917. Williams stayed with the squadron until the 28th of June, 1918, when he was seconded to command 40th Wing Palestine Brigade of the RAAF. This was the highest level of command held by an AFC officer during the war. Williams was pivotal in the formation and early years of the Australian Air Force, as I'll be talking about later. Frank McNamara was another key figure from one squadron. He was the only member of the AFC to be awarded the Victoria Cross, which he earned on the 20th of March, 1917, when, despite his own wounds, he rescued another pilot, Captain Doug Rutherford, who had been shot down during a bombing raid. After the war, he was one of the foundation members of the Australian Air Force, serving in the Second World War in various positions, including on loan to the Royal Air Force. Lawrence Wackett was an artillery officer who transferred to the AFC. Having a huge interest in aviation technology, he enjoyed modifying aircraft. Among his experiments in Palestine, he modified a machine gun mount on his BE-2C, allowing him to more easily shoot down enemy aircraft. With his technological skills recognised, Wackett was eventually sent to work at the Orfordness Experimental Station in Suffolk. After the war, he joined the Australian Air Force, qualified as an aeronautical engineer, and ran the RAAF experimental section, designing and building aircraft. Historian Alan Stevens has said that throughout his career, Wackett provided the technical innovation without which an Air Force cannot prosper. Hudson Fysh transferred to the AFC as an observer in 1916. After the war, he was a key figure in civil aviation in Australia. With Paul McGuinness, who he had served with and who he's pictured with here, he founded Qantas. During the Second World War, Fysh was a squadron leader in the Air Force Reserve and oversaw the use of Qantas equipment in the Pacific Theatre. For example, in 1943, Qantas ferried equipment and troops to New Guinea and evacuated casualties. Lastly is Ross Smith, who transferred from the Light Horse to the AFC in 1917. After the war, he contributed to civil aviation. With his brother Keith and two mechanics, Wally Shears and Jim Bennett, he flew from England to Australia in 28 days in late 1919. Unfortunately, in April 1922, while preparing for an around-the-world flight, he and Bennett were killed in a crash. Who brought that baby? Number 2 Squadron was one of the AFC's 2 fighter squadrons on the Western Front, starting operations in September 1917. It worked directly with British wings and brigades and was involved in air-to-air combat and providing direct support to ground troops. Among 2 Squadron's key figures was CO Oswald Watt. He initially served as a pilot with the French Foreign Legion before transferring to the AFC in 1916. He commanded B Flight of 1 Squadron before taking command of 2 Squadron as it was being formed in Egypt in September that year. In February 1918, he assumed command of the 4 training squadrons of the AFC stationed in England, and after the war, he returned to Australia where he was elected president of the New South Wales section of the Australian Aero Club. He lobbied politicians for improved safety measures in civil aviation, and he was known for his efforts to find employment for former AFC members. In 1920, he was offered the position of Controller of Civil Aviation, but declined because of business commitments. Sadly, he drowned in May 1921. Adrian Cole also started with 1 Squadron, joining Number 2 Squadron in May 1918. After the war, he was a foundation member of the Australian Air Force and from 1933 to 1936, commanded RAAF Station Richmond. He served during the Second World War and in September 1941, he was attached to the Royal Air Force's Western Desert Air Force in North Africa, briefly commanding a wing. 3 Squadron arrived on the Western Front in September 1917 to work as an Army Cooperation Squadron. Similar to 1 Squadron's role in the Middle East, it was responsible for artillery cooperation, bomb raids, reconnaissance, photography, and when needed, aerial combat. During 1918, this squadron worked with Monash's Australian Corps and the American Second Corps. Henry Wrigley graduated from the Central Flying School in Point Cook in 1916. In October, he joined the AFC and became a flight commander and temporary squadron commander. During November and December of 1919, he made the first aerial crossing of Australia, and in 1921, he was one of the foundation members of the Australian Air Force. He filled a number of influential positions in the Air Force headquarters during its early years, notably as a training officer in 1923 to 25, and then as the Director of Organisation and Staff Duties. At the start of the Second World War, he oversaw the Air Force's massive expansion and became the Air Member for Personnel, overseeing the establishment of the Air Training Corps. In 1943, he became Air Officer Commanding RAAF Overseas Headquarters, London. William Anderson initially served with 1 squadron before being appointed as a flight commander with No. 3 Squadron in August of 1917. The following year, he commanded No. 7 Training Squadron until October, when he returned to 3 Squadron, this time as its CO. When the Australian Air Force was formed, Anderson was one of its foundation members and its 3rd most senior officer. During the Air Force's early years, he was the 2nd Air Member of the Air Board while holding command of the Flying Training School at Point Cook. He remained a senior officer with the Air Force throughout the Second World War, eventually retiring in 1946. And Rolf Brown enlisted in the AFC in 1916, serving with 3 Squadron until April 1918. He then commanded No. 5 Training Squadron until the end of the war and went on to be one of the foundation members of the Air Force. Finally, No. 4 Squadron, like No. 2, was a fighter squadron on the Western Front, arriving in December of 1917. It was heavily involved during the German Spring Offensive the following year. Harry Cobby was an original member of 4 Squadron and became Australia's 3rd most successful air ace, with 29 victories behind Robert Little and Roderick Dallas, who both served directly with the RNAS. Cobby was a foundation member of the Australian Air Force before resigning in 1936. When the Second World War broke out, he returned to the Air Force. As an Air Commodore, he earned the George Medal in 1943 for rescuing survivors of an air crash in which he had been a passenger. In April 1945, he was in command of the 1st Tactical Air Force on Morotai, but was removed as a result of the Morotai Mutiny. After the war, Cobby left the Air Force in 1946 when he joined the Department of Civil Aviation, where he held senior appointments until he died in November 1955. As well as the AFC, there were, of course, Australians who, by their own choice, joined and served directly with the British Air Services. Stanley Goebel initially tried to enlist in the AIF, but was rejected twice on minor medical grounds. He decided to pay his own way to England, and in July 1915, he was accepted as a trainee airman in the RNAS. He was an original member of No. 8 Squadron, RNAS, which was among the naval squadrons attached for service on the Western Front. Later, he was appointed an acting flight commander with 5 Squadron, RNAS, and when the RAF was formed, he became a major in the new service. After the war, Goebel received a permanent commission as a squadron leader in the RAF. In 1919, he was made an honorary wing commander and seconded for service with the Australian Navy. At home, he was heavily involved in plans for the Australian Air Force, eventually resigning his RAF commission to become a foundation member and one of the key leaders of the Australian Air Force. The AFC's experience, and importantly the experience and influence of key figures like those I have just discussed, played a fundamental role in the post-war decision to create an Air Force in Australia. Without one key wartime event, though, this likely wouldn't have happened when it did, and that key event was the creation of the Royal Air Force. With German air attacks in London increasing in 1917, a Committee on Air Organisation and Home Defence Against Air Raids was established in Britain. It was headed by General Smuts, who was assisted in large part by David Henderson, who was the Director General of Military Aeronautics, to help him understand the air organisation as it was. Ultimately, Smuts recommended that the RFC and RNAS be amalgamated, and on the 1st of April 1918, this was done, bringing the RAF into place. Key figures, including Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig and Major General Hugh Trenchard, who was in command of the RFC in the field, were actually against the creation of an independent air force during wartime. Both considered aerial support to ground troops to be the fundamental use of air power at the time, and were concerned that removing the air service from the Army and the Navy threatened their ability to carry this out effectively. Historians have generally concluded that in practice, the creation of the RAF in 1918 was essentially an irrelevance to those who were actually conducting the air war. For them, it was nothing more than a name change. For the development of military aviation post-war, it was the setting of a precedent. The AFC was formally abolished in 1919, but military leaders had already been thinking about the next steps for aviation in Australia. Richard Williams later reflected that as it had been Australia's policy to follow the same organisation of defence forces as Britain's, it was likely that the events of 1918 would lead to an independent air force in Australia. After the RAF was created, the Australian Army and Navy immediately began planning for separate air services to meet their own individual requirements. On the 29th of April 1918, Chief of the General Staff, Major General Gordon Legg, put forward Army's bid for an air corps of 300 officers and 3,000 other ranks, requesting an immediate start to the construction of an initial 200 aircraft and 12 balloons. He later revised this with a proposal for 15 squadrons, schools, factories and repair shops, aircraft and depots, and a whole balloon wing. In this version, his personnel requirements had shot to 654 officers and some 7,200 other ranks. The Navy's proposal had come a fortnight after Legg's initial bid, with a plan for 2,000 officers and men operating 3 airship stations in Sydney, Melbourne and Fremantle, 2 schools and 2 seaplane stations. And so a period of intense struggle over limited funding began, and this would continue well into the first decade of the Air Force's existence. A committee was appointed by the Council of Defence on the 26th of June 1918 to assess the 2 bids, with both the Army and Navy insisting that their own proposal was essential and could not be changed. The committee wasn't willing to choose between the 2. When it went to Cabinet, £3 million was allocated to defence aviation broadly over a period of 3 years, but the Defence Council was tasked with deciding how the funds would be distributed. This was not enough for both the Army and Navy schemes to go ahead in their proposed forms, so both would have to compromise. In October, the Defence Council appointed another subcommittee, which, with both the Army and Navy still unwilling to budge, became the scene of constant disagreements. Commander Hugh Maguire, who had served with the RNAS and was now part of the RAF, had been engaged by the Australian Naval Board as an air advisor. On the 17th of September 1918, he proposed that Australia follow Britain and establish a single air service with its own minister and staff. While the board didn't endorse his proposal, it also didn't clearly reject it, so Maguire went ahead as if it had been approved. When it reached the subcommittee, Chief of the General Staff Legg strongly objected. The issue was then taken to yet another subcommittee, this time with more junior officers who decided that creating a separate, independent air force was, in fact, the most efficient and economical way ahead, as Maguire had initially advised. George Swinburne of the Defence Department produced a new report in January of 1919, reflecting this with the recommendation that a temporary body be established to prepare and implement plans for a new independent air force. This led to the creation of the Air Service Committee, with Swinburne as chairman, along with Maguire representing the Navy and Legg representing Army. By this point, the indecisiveness and inter-service rivalry had taken a serious toll on Maguire, who in late November 1918 requested to return home instead of wasting more time, as he put it. He eventually left in May 1919 and became the Australian liaison officer at the British Air Ministry, where he worked closely with Richard Williams, the AFC's most senior officer, and at the time in the role of Staff Officer for Aviation at AIF headquarters. Stanley Goebel would take Maguire's position as the Naval Board's air advisor from March 1919. In the meantime, the Air Service Committee got to work making preparations for a new independent air service. The question of control of a new service was repeatedly raised. Legg initially proposed that while independent, an air force could be jointly administered by the Army and the Navy, in addition to an air board. But before leaving Australia, Maguire had disagreed, maintaining that it should be administered entirely separately from the other 2 services. This remained a contentious issue for years to come, with neither the Army or the Navy wanting to relinquish control to a third equal service. Another of the Air Service Committee's first considerations was how to get aircraft and equipment, particularly while working with pretty limited funding in the immediate post-war period. Acting on advice from General William Birdwood, the commander of the AIF overseas, the Air Service Committee recommended the purchase of 15 Sopwith Snipe fighters, 15 Bristol fighters, 15 DH-9A day bombers, 15 Vickers-Vimy long-range night bombers, 20 Avro 504Ks as training aircraft, and 12 Sopwith Pup Scouts, which were actually already on order for the Central Flying School. Other than the pups, these purchases did not go ahead. In its first report to the Council of Defence in February 1919, the ASC proposed plans for expansion. In addition to the already existing Central Flying School at Point Cook, the Air Force would have stations in Corio Bay and Sydney. The organisation would encompass 1 seaplane or flying boat squadron, 4 land plane squadrons, 1 airship section, and 1 balloon section. A fairly modest plan, really, compared with the initial proposals put forward by the Army and the Navy in April 1918. In late February 1919, Maguire suggested that applicants for the new Air Force should initially be called for from AFC members who were at the time preparing to be repatriated to Australia. The process of filling senior positions, including the directors of air services and equipment and station commanders, started in April, but Prime Minister Hughes cabled Acting Prime Minister Watt from overseas, saying, "I earnestly hope that you will not appoint any but Australians to these or any other positions, because it would be quite wrong and exceedingly foolish." At this point, they hit the brakes altogether, opting to wait until the entire scheme was more matured. At this point, progress slowed. Senior government figures were being urged to avoid any further planning until AFC members made it back to Australia, which was sensible given they had the most up-to-date knowledge and experience of military aviation. War correspondent Henry Gullett reached out to Prime Minister Hughes, expressing concern that the Air Service Committee had taken on the role of an air board, questioning whether Maguire and Legg were suitably placed for making these kinds of decisions, and suggesting that matters be placed on hold at least until Major General Brudenell White reached Australia. In addition to this kind of influence, the government was probably interested in delaying any non-essential expenditure at this point. After 18 months of committees upon committees and endless debates between Army and Navy figures, all progress came to a sudden halt with the suspension of the air scheme on the 15th of September 1919. The Central Flying School would remain in place, but it effectively became nothing more than a stores section with no provision for further progress to be made on it. This was a huge setback. Progress resumed slowly early the next year. On the 1st of January 1920, the Australian Air Corps was formed within Army by reorganising the Central Flying School. It was overseen by a board of senior officers from both the Army and Navy. The Air Corps was a temporary formation whose role it was to maintain Australia's aviation equipment and assets, namely the Central Flying School, and prepare air route maps until an air force could be established to take over. In command was Major William Anderson, formerly of No. 3 Squadron, AFC, although Major Rolf Brown was initially in charge for 6 weeks as Anderson was on sick leave at the time. There was some upheaval at the Central Flying School with this decision, as not all of the existing staff could be offered a position in the small Air Corps. Legg, Chief of the General Staff, instructed Brown to select men who could be appointed to either the same or a higher position in an Air Force if and when one came to be, with preference to be given to returned servicemen. By the 2nd of January, Brown had filled 50 of the 70 positions available, with the remaining 20 to be filled through public advertisement. Given there were 410 pilots in the AFC at the end of the war, not to mention those serving directly with the RAAF, with many going on to pursue careers in aviation, it was understandably difficult to make these selections for the Air Corps. A notable omission, though, was Frank McNamara. Captain Roy King, formerly of No. 4 Squadron and in 1920 working with the Larkin Sopwith Aviation Company in Melbourne, declined the position he was offered with the Air Corps, writing back that there is a particularly bitter feeling around owing to Captain McNamara VC not being given an appointment to the new corps, and I feel I must forfeit my place in favour of this very good and gallant officer. McNamara was given a place in April. The Air Corps took on further personnel on an as-needed basis, with pressure for more staff soon coming when Imperial Gift aircraft began arriving later that year. After the First World War, Britain had been left with thousands of serviceable aircraft, and some dominions like Australia and New Zealand were considering their own aerial defence plans. In early 1919, Hugh Trenchard proposed gifting 100 surplus aircraft to each dominion that was interested in developing an air service, and this was soon approved by the British War Cabinet. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, and India each received aircraft dubbed the Imperial Gift. Richard Williams saw this scheme as invaluable for the creation of an air force, provided that the aircraft were useful and not outdated technology, and came with spare parts and engines, things that would be problematic to replace in Australia, lacking an established aircraft manufacturing industry. Australia covered the cost of transporting the aircraft from Britain, which was around £25,000 to £30,000, but this was the only cost. To establish the Air Force, Australia ended up with 128 aircraft, spare engines and parts, portable hangars, workshop vehicles, tools and stores, all of which were gifted. Richard Williams later wrote, "I wonder if any other nation has established a fighting service so economically." Australia's Imperial Gift aircraft arrived in 1920. These were 35 Avro 504K trainers, 35 Royal Aircraft Factory SE-5A fighters, 30 de Havilland, formerly Airco DH-9A bombers, and 28 de Havilland DH-9 bombers. The DH-9s were considered bonus machines in addition to the British offer of 100 aircraft, intended to be a replacement or payback for the 41 machines that Australia had donated during the war, which had been funded by donations from the public. Originally, these were meant to be Bristol fighters, but with these being unavailable, the DH-9s were accepted in their place. The 12 Sopwith pups that had been purchased for the Central Flying School also arrived with the Imperial Gift aircraft. Meanwhile, with the Navy unhappy that the Australian Air Corps was part of the Army, they pushed for the creation of an air board to administer the Air Corps and advise on organising the future permanent Air Force, ensuring that it met the needs of both the Army and the Navy. Along with the Minister for the Navy, who was Joseph Cook, the Defence Minister George Pearce took this recommendation to Cabinet. The temporary air board came into being in January 1920 with Brigadier General Thomas Blamey and Richard Williams representing Army, and Captain Wilfred Nunn and Stanley Goebel representing Navy. Charles Aughty, a public servant, acted as secretary to the Air Board. Until a more permanent system was in place, Pearce decided Williams, who was the acting director of military air services, would be responsible for all matters relating to the Air Corps, which upset Navy, who saw this as Williams, or the Army, being given an appointment that effectively meant he would be in charge of an air force when it came into being. The Navy only relented on this issue when it was explained that Williams would only be in charge of the existing establishment at Point Cook, with permanent appointments to be made in the future. At this point, there was another period of stagnation. It was not until November 1920 that the Governor-General finally approved regulations formally putting the Air Board and Air Council, which would sit above it, into place. At this point, the Air Board comprised Williams, Goebel, Captain Percy McBain as Director of Equipment, and Albert Joyce as the finance member. The Air Council, meanwhile, was headed by Minister for Defence George Pearce and comprised the Chiefs of the Naval and General Staff, 2 members of the Air Board, which was Williams and Goebel, and the Controller of Civil Aviation, Lieutenant Colonel Horace Brinsmead. Meanwhile, the Air Corps was making good use of the Imperial Gift aircraft. Adrian Cole took a DH-9 on a height test, reaching 27,000 feet before being forced down only because of a lack of oxygen. And Williams flew a DH-9A on the first non-stop flight between Sydney and Melbourne on the 22nd of July 1920. The Australian pilots continuously testing the aircraft and their own skills was a promising sign amidst the political and bureaucratical mess that instituting an air force was becoming. With the Air Board in place, the Army and Navy turned their attention to who would head the new service when it was formed. Rear Admiral Gran, the Chief of Naval Staff, pushed for Goebel to be the senior officer of the Air Service on the basis that the Navy was the senior service. Williams, somewhat self-serving, felt personally slighted by this and argued that Goebel didn't have the experience required to outrank him in an air service. Given Goebel's extensive experience on the Western Front, this is a pretty difficult argument to make. The two were in a jealous competition for years before the Air Force was formed, and it continued for years afterwards, to the point that they were purposefully separated, with one or the other often in Britain on staff college courses, because it was well known that they couldn't work together. By the start of 1921, the intent was there to create an Air Force, but there was no firm timeframe. The government was reluctant to spend money on defence immediately post-war, so a bit of a push was needed to take that final step. This came, surprisingly, in the form of airmail. The government wanted to establish airmail services in remote regions of Australia. When Cabinet approved this in September 1920, it was decided that an Air Force unit would be formed as soon as funds, material, and personnel were available. For his part, Richard Williams was firmly against the use of military aircraft for any civil purposes, especially so early on. Ultimately, though, the Air Council discussed the matter at its meeting on the 3rd of February 1921, decided it should go ahead, and instructed the Air Board to prepare and submit proposals to enable the immediate establishment of an Air Force and to initiate an experimental aerial mail service. This was a bit of a double-edged sword for Williams. He was finally able to bring the Air Force into being, but it came with dealing with airmail. With Williams and Goebel both in good standing to lead the new Air Force, it was ultimately decided that both would hold the rank of Wing Commander from the date of the service's formation, but Williams would be senior and fill the role of First Air Member, which was later changed to the Chief of the Air Staff. This arrangement did nothing to alleviate the jealous rivalry between the two, particularly given Goebel would act as Chief of the Staff during all of Williams' absences. Now knowing that he would head it, Williams had the privilege of choosing a start date for the Air Force. Rather than following Britain and choosing the 1st of April, which at the time was the start of the financial year, he chose the 31st of March. He recalled that he didn't want his service being referred to as the April Fools. The personnel for the Air Force largely came by taking over the bulk of the Air Corps' strength, but as there was no requirement for them to transfer, some members chose to discharge rather than join the new service. On the 31st of March, 1921, the Air Force comprised 21 officers and 128 other ranks. By the end of June, this had risen to 25 officers and 195 other ranks. That month, King George V permitted the prefix Royal to be added, and when this came into effect in August 1921, the service became known as the Royal Australian Air Force. The challenges didn't end there. The first decade of the Air Force's existence was marked by a fierce inter-service rivalry, a struggle to get the resources it needed to develop, a lack of funding not helped by the Great Depression, and attempts to dissolve the Air Force as a separate service. Funding was an immediate problem, and one which the Air Force had very little control or even influence over. For the 1921 to 22 financial year, the new service was allocated approximately £382,000. In 1922, after the apparent success of the International Disarmament Conference, the government intended to limit defence spending. This was evident in the next financial year's allocation to the Air Force, which was now down to £250,000, limiting its program of development. Further, there was a reduction in the number of airmen who could enlist in the Air Force, capping it at 300. Through to mid-1924, the service remained at a strength of just 50 officers and 300 men, with no ability to grow. With defence spending limited, the Air Force had little choice but to use by now outdated aircraft throughout the 1920s, which was criticised by the press and by the Labor Party, which was in opposition at the time. The Air Council had recognised that post-war budgets meant the Air Force would receive limited funding, so it had no hope of maintaining state-of-the-art aircraft. Williams rightly believed that instead of trying to, it was better to spend the money that they were allocated on more permanent infrastructure like buildings and workshop equipment, and on training its personnel in order to build up the capabilities of the service. This was a sensible approach. By the time the Second World War broke out, any aircraft they had acquired in the 1920s and even the early 1930s would inevitably have been outdated technology, but they had constructed air bases which could immediately be used, and the investment they were able to make in personnel was invaluable during wartime. Between 1926 and 1929, the Air Staff expected a small increase in the Air Force's budget to bring it up to around £500,000, which, although a substantial increase, historian Alex Spencer has described as still woefully inadequate. Still flying aircraft from the First World War, the Air Force now found itself in danger of being outnumbered and outclassed by the Japanese Naval Air Service, a very real threat. To rectify the situation, the Air Staff estimated they needed around £2.5 million per year from 1927 to 1931. But this was well beyond what the government could afford at the time. In fact, despite being a new service that needed to establish and develop itself from the ground up, including everything from personnel to aircraft and land and structures for bases, the Air Force received a very small percentage of the defence budget. During the new service's first 9 years, the total defence funding had been £57,545,000. Of this, the Air Force received £3,635,000, or just 7.5%. With resources and funding tight during the 1920s, the Air Force had found itself very much pitted against the two established services, neither of which was overly happy about its existence or about sharing limited defence funding. In the late 1920s, Prime Minister Stanley Bruce invited the RAAF to review the condition and needs of the RAAF as part of a review of the Pacific defences and how Australia fit into the Imperial Defence Scheme. Williams welcomed this, hopeful that an RAF officer would back him up in his argument that the strength of his service needed to be substantially increased. He suggested Geoffrey Salmond was the man for the job, who he had served under during the First World War. With him unavailable, he in turn recommended his brother, John Salmond, who at the time was the air officer commanding the air defences of Great Britain. John Salmond arrived in Australia in late June 1928 and spent 3 months reviewing the Air Force's equipment, training, organisation, development and policy. His report deemed that the Air Force was unfit for war in its current state. He found that there was a low standard of training and worn-out equipment. By the late 1920s, the Air Force's aircraft and equipment were obviously beyond due for replacement, and this in turn had an effect on the quality of training able to be undertaken. Perhaps more alarmingly, given Williams' focus on developing the Air Force's personnel, the service was losing airmen at an astonishing rate. Salmond found that in the previous 2 years, 10 officers and 136 airmen, or 15% of its total strength, had decided to leave the Air Force to take up better offers elsewhere. Already undersized, the Air Force could not afford to continue losing personnel like this and remain a viable independent force. In terms of a solution, Salmond proposed a 9-year plan, which involved re-equipping the existing 5 squadrons with new aircraft and establishing new units, which would be an Army Cooperation Squadron in Canberra, a fighter squadron and a flying boat reconnaissance flight at Point Cook, a flying boat reconnaissance flight in Sydney, a bomber reconnaissance squadron and a fighter flight at Richmond, and a bomber reconnaissance squadron at Laverton. But the budget didn't exist for this. Prime Minister Stanley Bruce told the Defence Council that there was not the slightest hope of increasing the amount of money available for defence in 1928 to 29. So the reforms of Salmond's report were put on the back burner. The report would later be used as the basis for the Air Force's policy of expansion from 1934, when funding was more readily available. As soon as 1929, the Air Force found itself under siege. The Defence Committee, comprising the 3 service chiefs and a finance member, had examined a proposal from Army and Navy officers to merge the Air Force with their services, and its findings were presented at a Council of Defence meeting on the 12th of November, 1929. The Prime Minister chaired the meeting, and the other attendees were the Treasurer, the Defence Minister, and the Chiefs of Staff of the 3 services. Attending with Admiral Napier was Admiral Evans, and with Lieutenant General Chauvel were Generals John Monash and Brunel White. Williams later reflected, "I did not know that one could bring one's friends to these meetings, so I was alone." He found himself up against 3 Army officers and 3 Navy officers, all opposing the continuation of the Air Force as an independent service. Chauvel, Monash and White all voiced their objections to the Air Force's status as a separate service, repeating arguments that there was no role for an independent Air Force and there were limited resources available for all of defence. The committee argued, with Williams obviously dissenting, that it could see no reason for maintaining a separate organisation for the Air Force. Monash drew on his experience of working closely with the AFC during the war, with No. 3 Squadron allocated to his corps for cooperation in France. He argued that he had issued orders for them in the same way he had for other units under his command, and he saw no reason for this not to be the case moving forward. Williams said that it was true that Army Cooperation Squadrons had carried out orders given by the Corps Commander, but pointed out that those squadrons had formed a very small part of an Air Force. Even in the AFC, only one of the 4 squadrons worked this way. The other 75% worked independently of the Australian Corps. Williams fought hard for his service. His main argument was that the Air Force was capable of so much more than what air power had been used for during the First World War, but to do so, it had to remain independent. Aviation would be fully developed in all its aspects only by airmen, he said. Ultimately, Williams was successful in stopping, or at the very least, stalling, the threat against the Air Force. He was most likely helped in this by Prime Minister James Scullins' reluctance to take a step as drastic as dissolving the Air Force so early into his tenure as Prime Minister. At the time of the meeting, he had been Prime Minister for just 3 weeks. After the meeting, the matter went quiet. It was eventually clear that the threat had passed, with the announcement on the 12th of June the following year that the Air Force units and establishments would be maintained as they were. From there, the Air Force spent the 1930s slowly building up. With funding becoming more available from 1934, it was finally able to start implementing the reforms from Salmon's report for expansion and modernisation, steadily growing into the force that served during the Second World War. As I'm quickly running out of time, I'm not going to go into this period of development, which is outside the scope of what I'm covering today, but will be discussed in detail in my thesis. But there is one final challenge faced by the Air Force in the interwar period that I will address. In late 1937, there was a series of accidents involving Hawker Demon fighter bombers, which were quite modern aircraft, having been purchased in 1935. There were 9 accidents within a 3-week period, most of which were fairly minor, but one did result in a pilot being killed. This resulted in Prime Minister Joseph Lyons announcing in 1938 that a senior RAAF officer would once again be brought in to report on the Air Force. This was Edward Ellington, the Inspector General of the RAF. Although the Army was going through a similar process at the time, the Air Board was particularly apprehensive about Ellington's visit. This wasn't helped by the fact that the government didn't tell the Air Board or Williams that this was happening until a decision had already been made and Ellington was on his way, immediately putting them on the defensive. Ellington began his inspection in June 1938, a full 10 years after Salmon's. He submitted his report on the 16th of July, finding that the Air Board and Williams were grossly at fault for the accidents. For its part, the Air Board contended that the accident rate had naturally increased along with an increase in hours being flown as a result of the Air Force's expansion, and that most of the pilots involved had less than 2 years of flying experience, which obviously put them at greater risk of accidents. Historian Alex Spencer points out that there appears to have been a little bit more behind Ellington's inspection than just looking at the accident rate, noting that the government may have been looking for a way to remove Williams from his position as head of the Air Force. Ellington did later tell Frank McNamara, who Williams asked to look into it, that a question of a change of command for the Air Force had been initiated by a certain minister in Australia. Maybe this was an intentional move from government, but even if it wasn't, at the very least, Williams arguably became the scapegoat for the whole situation. He was removed from his role of Chief of the Air Staff in January 1939 after 17 years. He was sent on exchange with the RAF and initially replaced by Goebel, but this was relatively short-lived too. As in the early stages of the Second World War, Prime Minister Robert Menzies ultimately decided that the Australian Air Force should be led by a senior RAF officer, and Air Marshal Sir Charles Burnett filled the role. Williams remained bitter about his removal of Chief of the Air Staff for the rest of his life, undoubtedly made all the more frustrating by watching someone else leading the service he had driven into existence into war. Ultimately, the challenges faced and huge efforts made by the Air Force during the interwar period paid off. At the outbreak of war, it had 246 serviceable aircraft, but this grew substantially during the war. By the end of the war, the Air Force was operating 63 combat squadrons in the Pacific, and a further 17 RAAF designated squadrons formed part of the Royal Air Force. Historian Alex Spencer has concluded that by the end of the Second World War, the world's air forces were larger and stronger than any pre-war strategist could have imagined. That may be so, but those who were relentlessly pushing air power and the development of their air forces, in Australia none more tenaciously than Richard Williams, might just have had an inkling. Thank you.
Ash has graciously agreed to take a few questions. Are there any questions, please? James is first.
Ash, regarding the safe operating procedure, now the AFC in World War I was they were operational, and getting the job done was the main matter. I get the impression in the organisation of the Royal Australian Air Force just after World War I, they were mainly composite squadrons, number 1 and number 3. and they had a bomber flight, a reconnaissance flight, a fighter flight, and the majority of the people that passed through the squadron were civilian.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I've got the name of the service.
Citizens Air Force.
Citizens Air Force,
Yeah.
yes, right. And it seems like safety just didn't really emerge as a cultural thing within the other
Yeah, I think that's a fair point to make. I haven't looked too much into that at this point. It's entirely possible they were just focused on other things. Safety maybe was less of a consideration. Obviously, that's why Ellington is brought out in the late 30s to look into that accident rate. I don't think accidents had been particularly prevalent up until that point, but that's possibly because the flying hours were fairly low as well. So it just may have been something that was, I don't know, out of sight, out of mind a little bit.
The accidents did occur a lot minor in nature
Yeah, correct.
and not fatal,
Mm-hmm.
but there were a lot of injuries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
Air Marshal Sir George Jones was very brief autobiography mentions claims that Williams, when setting up the Air Force and appointing people to senior positions, looked after his mates from one squadron. Did you find him with that?
Yes, yeah, I would say that that's a fair point. You might remember from the early slide that I showed of key figures in Australian military aviation and how many of them are attributed to one squadron from the AFC. I don't know if there is another explanation, to be honest, other than Williams was in a position of power. He knew them. Certainly he was interested in working with people that he knew well, and he was very big on, I want people around who I know I can work with, who I know I can speak to, which is, you know, again, it's a self-serving reason why he suggested Jeffrey Salmon to do the initial report on the Australian Air Force as well. I don't know, all of the personalities involved and the relationships, it's a bit messy, the way that they're intermingled. I don't know what the relationship between Jones and Williams was, if there's any other reason he might be making that claim, but certainly I think there's probably merit to it.
Thank you. Thank you.
yeah. In 1914, Australia was a part of the British Empire. And it seemed our constitution demanded that we go to war regardless. There was no option. So the British Empire influence was very strong. And then the imperial gift in 1920 virtually kicked off the RAAF. And then you mentioned the interventions of RAAF officers in the operation of the Air Force. And then in 1939, Menzies said, as a consequence, we're at war with Germany. When did that connection with the British Empire and our obligation to go to war, if England declared war on anyone, that's obviously not the case now. Where did that influence dissipate?
I don't know whether I would say it completely dissipated during the Second World War, but I think it shrank during the Second World War as a natural consequence of Australia looking to another powerful ally. So in the Second World War, obviously Britain is pretty occupied elsewhere and not as concerned with the Pacific as Australia might have wanted it to be. So we naturally turned to America, and I would say that we now have that kind of reliance on them that maybe we had with Britain during the time of empire.
Can I add something to that? The British Statute of Westminster in 1931 allowed the self-governing dominions to make their own decisions on such a thing.
Yep.
Now, Australia had succession of conservative governments who never ratified the statute, and it wasn't until John Curtin took office in 1941, pretty much the next day, that statute was ratified by the Australian government.
Back to Sir Richard Williams, have you come across the documentation of his fight to establish an aircraft industry in Australia and the British objections to that because they could supply anything we needed?
Yes. Yeah, I have. So there are a few people pushing for an aircraft industry in Australia. Even the Australian government is really, from even in the First World War, is pushing to create an aircraft industry in Australia afterwards. It's not really something that takes off very much in the interwar period, as you said, because Britain is assuring Australia, we will provide everything that you need. Getting closer to when it looks like war is going to break out again, that becomes a pretty huge concern in Australia, and they start looking to America for aircraft. That upsets Britain. So why are you getting aircraft somewhere else? We can give you the aircraft, but their factories were so backed up building what they needed. I don't know if it was ever realistic that they could supply the whole empire.
The minister's pamphlet that was published put out to explain why they picked the Ruraway?
No.
Okay. That'll be on time.
Yeah, okay, that sounds good.
I'd like to ask, what was the main game for an up and coming RAAF officer in the 1920s? Was it to break and go and pursue a career in the Royal Air Force? Were officers hard done by if in the war they hadn't served in the AFC? And what's behind McNamara? He made his own decision
He
to
did.
quit and go to the UK.
Yeah.
And even keep his VC.
Yes. Yeah. So I think it was tough being in the Australian Air Force in the interwar period. I come across a lot of things complaining about their pay compared to Army and Navy. It's obviously a struggle to try and get the organisation up and running. It might have been appealing to go straight to the RAF and try and join that, particularly if they had served directly with the RAF during the war. Maybe you would be more inclined to just stay there. It's already established. They arguably have more funding, more modern aircraft. McNamara, I don't know. I suspect he would have had a few things to say about the way that he was treated by the organisation during that period.
Thank you very much. We invite our patron, Mark Minskin, to thank Ashleigh and to present her with a certificate of appreciation.
So I'd like to thank Ash. What you highlighted in that period highlights a couple of things. People ask the question, why didn't we do an Air Force aircraft industry? Why didn't we do that? Simple answer is dollars. You have all the visions in the world that you want, but unless the money goes there, you can't get it straight. And probably less for us today. Don't get me started. As a successor to Richard Williams, I look back at what he did and the hard work and the drive, because we didn't be the Air Force we were in the Second War. It wasn't him, and the fact that it might not have all got on, but actually they all understood that it needs to be the head of the Air Force, which actually has led to today to be one of the most capable Air Forces in the world. So, Ash, thank you for that. That's a little known history in the Australian history, and I think it was one that should be known. So I look forward to seeing it when it's all finished. But on behalf of the society, please take this certificate of appreciation and thanks for coming up today. Thank you for that. Perfect. Thanks, Ash.
And that's from the committee.
Thank you very much for that.
Ladies and gentlemen, that completes this afternoon's proceedings. I want to.
Well, I just wondering if somebody was here who could just give us a 30-second burst on Eric Watson, as it's the Eric Watson Memorial Lectures.
Yes, so I would invite Gareth.
Just a background.
I'd like to, I didn't meet the man, sorry.
Okay, well, I can do it for you.
Right.
No, it used to be about half of this by the World War I aircraft flying where they've all got E.A. Watson. last year this year at the Canberra Lifeline Book Club, I picked up another book on World War II. It's a great open up the big.
Yeah.
E.A. Watson. Eric was a terrific bloke who was president of the society for many years, and vice president. He must be a treasurer and a secretary, just about every other position to be. So thank you for all the current position, the current members of the committee for carrying on. But he was also very passionate about his history, about aircraft, and he used to run a quiz, a photographic quiz of 100 pictures to see if you could pick out the names of the aircraft. If you got more than 2/3, you were an expert. So I think it's very fitting that we've had Ash today to give a lecture in his name, and I've been pondering Eric. I believe he passed away some years ago from cancer. He did smoke a lot, so there's a hint. But just to remember Eric when we do this annual lecture, it's a great thing. Thank you so much.
Eric, first, is that this society would not have survived except for working interest. A certain number of years when the leadership fellow that looked like we're going to be in the future. Eric has kept working and kept it going.
Thank you, everyone.